that very excellent presentation. We're going to get in there. And Judith is going to talk to us about the mining tax.
Thank you, Sinclair. So what I thought I'd do is, having accepted Sinclair's principles of tax design, I thought I might use the mining tax as a case study. And I guess you'd have to say it was a case study of what not to do. I must admit, I really enjoyed myself around that time. I guess you did, Sinclair, and I guess you did, Henry, because, you know, it was so egregious. It was so misinformed. It was so ill-designed that, you know, it was pretty easy pickings for public commentators like us. But take your mind back to the Henry Tax Review. Of course, there was a terrible governance mistake in the Henry Tax Review because it was completely inappropriate to place the Secretary to the Treasury as the chairman of the Henry Review, of that review. And I think that did lead to a lot of the issues down the track, as a matter of fact, because what would normally have happened is that you might have a review with the Secretariat based probably in Treasury, but an independent chair, and then take those recommendations and then, you know, possibly adjust them, test drive them, adjust them again. But because the Treasury Secretary had been the chairman of that review, I think it always compromised the advice that then came from Treasury itself. Look, I was trying to figure out, you know, there are so many numbers around. How many recommendations were there in the Henry Review? There was like over 100. And, you know, Wayne Swan was obviously a bit put out by it and took the report down to the beach at Maroochydore and sat there and flipped through it and decided after some months that the one which was the real goal was the mining tax, leaving the others to another day. It was an extraordinary decision. I mean, admittedly, I guess we were in the throes of mining boom Mark II. And the proposal, which, as you will probably recall, was called the RSPT, I like that, you could almost sing a song to it, was based, well, actually partly based on a very obscure working paper. As far as I can see, Sinclair, I don't think it was ever published in a journal. 1949 working paper by an economist called Carey Brown, who proposed a form of rent tax. I think his variation, though, was that in the case of the rent tax, the government would actually pony up with the cash to cover the losses, whereas our version, as I'll explain in a minute, didn't have that feature. So it was early, cast your mind back, it was early May 2010, just prior to the budget, and all of a sudden we were told that this tax was going to come in to cover all mineral groups, as a matter of fact, including salt and gypsum, if you like, clinker for cement, and oil and gas. And effectively the government was going to steal, and I don't think that's too strong a word, 40% of all existing and future mining projects. It really was a classic case of expropriation. And it's at an interesting point, Sinclair and I were talking about this before, and it's a frightening thought in a way, whether they would have actually got away with it if they'd maybe gone 10%, but they went 40%. And part of the deal was that the losses that any of these projects incurred, they would be provided for by the government with an IOU. I love that idea. You know, they weren't going to be ponying up with the cash, even though arguably they had the financial capacity to do that. And this was based on the assumption that the mining companies could trot off to the financial services sector and get that amount financed at zero transaction cost at the long-term bond rate. So it was an IOU, which presumably was subject to a high degree of sovereign risk, because down the track a future government might say, well, we don't like that idea. But this was the assumption that, the financial services would be able to provide the cover, but at zero transaction costs. I mean, you wonder what Ken Henry was smoking at that time, really. It was also, I mean, I guess to give Ken Henry's sum due, although I don't believe this part of the review, I think he was recommending that this be a tax to replace state royalties. And the thing is that that was another bit that the government kind of missed out, because in fact the state governments found out about the new mining tax at the same time we all did. And so the royalties were going to remain in place. I remain totally unconvinced about the estimates of the deadweight costs of the royalties that are included in the Henry Review. And having been a director of a mining company for a long time, what is hard for people to appreciate, and I mean obviously the theory is that if you are imposing a production or a value-based royalty arrangement which is not profit related, it can both be inhibiting at the beginning of projects and can hasten them at the end. But what that analysis fails to understand is that at a state level particularly, you can do special deals. So a mining company can go to a state government and say, well, under the existing royalty arrangement for this project, we are going to have to shut this down next year, but if you can negotiate some different royalty arrangement, then the thing can keep going for a couple more years. And that flexibility is, I think, a really important bit of the story, because you could never get that, I don't think, at the national level. So on we went. I mean, it was good times. Remember Rudd sort of wandering around the country telling us all sorts of things. You know, it was going to be good for the tourists. Oh, first of all, it wasn't going to affect mining output or investment, which of course is consistent with theory, because, you know, arguably we were supposed to be imposing a rent tax. But then all of a sudden it was going to be good for tourism and education because the mining industry was going to grow more slowly. So it was getting really seriously incoherent by that point. I mean, there were some other really nasty aspects of it. There was some sort of tax shield associated with it, but that tax shield was based on the historic costs and not on market basis. So that was really adding to the degree of expropriation which was part of that design. Look, you know, it's one of my favourite emails. I'm sure you will get lots of emails and don't archive much, but at one stage I did get an email from Ken Henry which started with, "Dear Judith, I used to think you're an intelligent woman." But that was okay because I replied, "Dear Ken, I used to think you're an intelligent man." And I thought, in a sense, the apotheosis of that time was when Ken Henry put out the word to us economists that it was time for us to put down our weapons, which is kind of almost a bit reminiscent of the climate change debate. You know, as far as he was concerned, this was settled and we should all shut up. I think also to underscore that Treasury had no idea what they were doing was with the revenue projections. You know, they were hilarious, and I think hilariously wrong. And I'll get onto that with the MRT, but seriously, they had absolutely no idea. So they were putting, you know, and the numbers were very substantial with the projections, but according to the modelling of the mining companies, which I was much more inclined to believe, they were probably considerably below what they were going to be. You know, it's like we're talking about, you know, $30 billion a year once the thing was up and running. So, you know, in some ways, I guess it was like surface paradise, that, you know, it was so bad it was good. And it, of course, led to the demise of Kevin Rudd. I mean, I think that was the trigger that led to him being replaced by our Jules. Of course, she then had no idea too, and I think there is a continuation of what not to do with the mineral resource rent tax. So then they decided all of a sudden that that was only going to cover iron ore and coal. So I guess that made the negotiations more manageable. Although, in a way, I don't know whether you should be negotiating these things. By all means, consult. So we were really down to 4 big companies. Or was it 3? 3. So we had BHP, Rio and Xstrata. It was some sort of supernormal profits tax. I don't know. But the key change, I guess, apart from dropping the expropriation to 40%, was that the tax shield was able to be calculated at market prices at that time. And at that time was actually pretty much the peak of the market. So it's not clear that actually the big companies, those big three, will ever pay any substantial tax ever, assuming that this isn't ditched in the meantime. I mean, Treasury remained in a state of not getting it, in my opinion. And again, I mean, what I would have thought was an extraordinarily embarrassing event was, you know, their complete inability to have a clue as to what the real revenue projections were going to be. And I mean, you know, if you're working in private sector in the accounting department, you'd be getting sacked. But, you know, this was absolutely extraordinary. And I think, and Sinclair might like to talk about this because he's tried to drum some sense into the Treasury people from time to time. They really have no ability to make tax revenue projections, but in this case it seemed to me that they didn't really understand the tax, and therefore they really had no ability to know whether they were Arthur or the Martha. Of course there was also, and again, you know, because they never tackled the issue of replacing the state royalties, there was that funny loophole that our Wayne, you miss it, don't you? Managed to let through, which was basically that there's a rebate back by the state royalties, and of course the incentive was for the state governments to increase their royalty rates, which West Australia and Queensland promptly did. So it really was an incredibly sorry saga, and I guess one of the issues now, and I'm fully supportive of them getting rid of this, because as Henry has given a fantastic presentation about this tax, is that you might think, well, it sits there, it's hardly raising any revenue, you know, why not keep it? But its design features are actually very harmful to new risky ventures. And this is because those new risky ventures are not going to have the tax shield in place. And then if in the event things go extremely well, it's actually punitive. So basically it remains sitting there as, I think, being very hostile to something which we otherwise would want to encourage. So what were the lessons of that? I think the first one is to always be very wary of the theory, and I guess that's one of your points, Sinclair, is that, you know, it's all very well saying, yeah, tax the rent. And in theory that might be right, but the trouble is it's very difficult to identify the rent, and then basically impossible to estimate the magnitude of the rent. And I think there are really very few situations where the supply curve does not actually slope upwards. The other thing is, and again it's a thing that Sinclair raised, is that these theories tend to completely ignore the transaction costs. And the transaction costs of these kinds of taxes are absolutely enormous. Now, it mightn't have raised much money for the federal government, but I tell you what, there are quite a lot of accounting firms that have done very well out of mining tax, because you've got to figure out that you're not going to pay anything. And that doesn't come cheap. I think another lesson is that the Treasury really doesn't understand how industries work, and they don't understand how firms work. And until they actually get some more intelligence along those lines, their revenue projections are going to remain extremely sus. I guess it also means that they're going to have to consult, which I think is probably a bit of a grubby game for them, that it's really the only way forward. And I think that the final point I would make is that, you know, everyone in Canberra is a centralist, Henry, possibly part of you. And, you know, to have ignored the states in the way they did was just crazy. If you'd really wanted to do this, you would have had to involve the states at a very early stage, in my opinion, and come to some agreement, particularly with West Australia and Queensland on this. And then the whole thing might have had, you know, more going for it. But to confront the states in that way was absolute madness, because they also became immediate enemies. So, you know, I'm hoping for maybe not a repeat of that, but as I said, it was a bit of fun. But maybe in Q&A we can have a discussion about the deficit levy and where that fits in, what should be done and what should not be done when it comes to tax reform. Thanks very much.